I'm sure there's other ways in which the Septuagint exercised influence on New Testament authors. One area that comes to mind is that of its vocabulary, whether we think of diatheke, covenant, doxa, glory, and there's a number of terms. Would it be correct to say that this is another area of influence, or can you provide some examples of other ways in which the Septuagint exercised influence on New Testament authors?
Yes, the old Greek translation, I think, influenced the New Testament in many different ways, not just through citations. Examples, I think, could be found of many different varieties. For example, it is supposed that the first two chapters of Luke's Gospel reflect a style of Greek found in the Septuagint and its vocabulary, and this apparently was purposeful on the part of the writer, perhaps to show a linkage between the sort of the piety of the people that are involved in the birth and the early years of Jesus, and the later church traditions and so forth. Funkbless and de Brunner in Greek grammar, they outline various kinds of influence. For example, the verbal phrase, answering, he said, seems to reflect a Semitic expression. Whether Hebrew or Aramaic can be debated, but it's probably being transferred into the New Testament primarily through the influence of Septuagint formulation. Another example might be formulations related to the expression to lift up the face, prosopolemptos. This is a term, compound term that's not attested earlier than Septuagint or the New Testament, and it does seem to show, again, the kind of influence that Septuagint language and vocabulary had upon the language of the early church. Primarily, again, because the early church is born in a Jewish religious context and so forth. Another example might be the phrase kai edu, and behold, or and look, right? Again, this is something you find used in the Septuagint translation. We also find, of course, various important elements of terminology that the translators incorporated into the Septuagint, becoming important in the New Testament. You mentioned terms like diatheke, covenant, the word nomos, law, or the term doxa, glory, that are used quite frequently within the Septuagint and get, again, incorporated into the language of the early church. An example that perhaps is particularly relevant is the choice of the term ecclesia, church, to describe the new messianic assemblies, particularly in Paul's letters. This may owe its adoption to its use in the Septuagint to define the Israelite covenant community in books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so forth. Of course, it's also used within general Hellenistic language to describe any kind of assembly. But it sort of has that shade of meaning, as it were, that's particularly compatible with what is happening in the early Christian movement because of perhaps its prior use within the Septuagint and so forth. When we come to things like the titles of Jesus, the Son of Man, this seems again to have relationship back into particularly texts like Daniel 7, where in the vision a figure like a Son of Man is an important part of the revelation and so forth. In Revelation 1 and verse 8, we find God described as the one who is and the one who was. And perhaps this kind of language can be traced back to the formulation in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14 that defines the name of God. So the tetragrammaton in that context is related to this expression haon, the one who is, and so forth. Mm-hmm. We also find some terms transliterated in the Septuagint that, again, carry over into the New Testament. The word for woe, for example, or the term alleluia, which we find occurring in some of the Septuagint materials also occurs in the New Testament. When Jesus says he's going to celebrate the Passover with his followers in Mark chapter 14, verse 1, the term used is ta pascha, the Passover. And this, of course, reflects the term that's used in Exodus 12 of the Septuagint translation. So we find Greek terms being introduced through the Septuagint into Jewish theological and liturgical parlance, and these in turn showing up within the context of the New Testament. And so there's this influence that is quite pervasive from this linguistic standpoint, lexical standpoint in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Larry. This is quite interesting. What does this say, in your opinion, about the New Testament authors' familiarity with the Septuagint? It's been argued, for example, that Paul probably knew Septuagint Isaiah by heart. So can we assume that for the most part, the New Testament writers are using Septuagint as their Bible?
Yes, I think certainly it attests to familiarity with the Septuagint, but probably also more with the sort of the general Jewish religious terminology, particularly of sort of diaspora Judaism, but even Hellenistic Judaism as it appears and occurs within Judea, Jerusalem, and Galilee itself. We know that there were Hellenistic synagogues, for example, in Jerusalem, and some of the early Christian, how should we say, converts come out of that movement. We think about Stephen, we think about Paul himself, and so presumably within these synagogues, the Septuagint version was the one used as their sort of Bible, both in discussions and liturgical practices and so forth. The fact that the majority of citations, I think, in the Septuagint have their greatest affinity with the Old Greek version probably indicates that most writers of the New Testament were familiar with some documents in the Septuagint and could access them from time to time. I'm sure the degree of familiarity varied from writer to writer, and also in terms of which documents in the Septuagint might have been viewed as helpful. We do see concentration on certain portions like Torah or the Psalms or the prophets or something like that, which suggests that they were not accessing all portions of the Septuagint equally, or had some guidance in some way that not all portions of the Old Testament were equally relevant to the mission of Jesus and the nature of the church as it was developing and so forth. In my view, I think they generally regarded the Old Greek version as equally authoritative with the Hebrew text. And if they did notice differences between the Greek writings and the Hebrew writings, they probably would tend to regard these as sort of fuller expressions of the intended meaning of the Hebrew text rather than differences or contradictions, as it were. And so I think this would be an example of them seeing the text with understanding rather than seeing it as an opportunity to manipulate the Jewish tradition in a way that would necessarily support their particular ideology, as the case may be. So in this way, I think we find that the New Testament writers display a range of sophistication when it comes to using the Old Greek materials. A writer such as the writer of Hebrews, for example, seems to have a very, how shall I say, comprehensive sense of these Old Greek texts and uses them with tremendous skill in the development of his writing and so forth. I think we have to remember that many of these early Christian leaders and writers either were Jewish people themselves or were God-fearers that had some relationship with the Jewish movement before ever they became part of the Christian environment.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I'm sure there's a lot of debates in this area and lots more research necessary. vocabulary or lexical aspect of this is very interesting as well. Could you point to some resources that explore these kinds of connections between the Septuagint and the New Testament?
The older Theological Dictionary of the New Testament by Kittle, even though it has its flaws, nevertheless, usually with the terms that have some association with Septuagint, will have a section where they try to evaluate the Septuagintal nuances of the term. And so this can be a useful place to start. The 3-volume Theological Lexicon of the New Testament by Celsus Speak also can be very helpful, even though it's limited in terms of its scope. We now have the 10 volumes of new documents illustrating early Christianity, and often within their pages, one can find useful discussions about Septuagintal nuances and semantic influence and so forth. And now we have a new historical and theological lexicon of the Septuagint that is being published. I think the first volume is slated to be published this fall. That is going to be looking at all of the vocabulary in the Septuagint and providing an extensive commentary on each term within the scope of this publication. So I think this will be sort of the best resource once it is finally published.
Good. Yes, I believe they have a selection of terms actually, right?
Yes.
Main terms, but for each term, they look at the history of its usage.
That's correct.
Before
That's
the Septuagint, in the Septuagint, and after. So
Yes.
yeah, very, very good tool. Well, thank you, Larry.